Welcome to our intimate group with Congressman John Shimkus. I think you were in for a very interesting and informative discussion. My name's Joellen Chatham. I'm the Director of the Center for Civics Education here at Concordia. We welcome you, and we know we're going to have a very interesting evening. I'd like to have Dr. Michael Thomas, the president of Concordia University, come up and welcome you, and also just tell you a little bit about the university.
Joellen asked me to say a little more than just about the university, so I got a little history lesson for you. But let me first start with this. Good evening to all of you. And again, you heard my name is Michael Thomas. If you don't know me, although most of you know me, and I have the honor and the privilege to serve here as the president. It's also my honor to welcome you to this terrific event on this one of the celebrations of Constitutional Week here at Concordia University Irvine. So if you're a visitor, or welcome home, right? Congressman Shimkus went to school here when it was Christ College, so welcome home. And so, but if you're a visitor here with us tonight, I want to give you a brief introduction to Concordia, but that will require a little bit of history. And so we're going to go back and tie this to Constitution Week, at least tangentially. But I hope that history will be of great interest to you as citizens of this great nation. But the roots of this story, in fact, the roots of Concordia go back 500 years. They go back to a monk in the 16th century who caused quite a stir in his day. But in fact, the Western world, at least as we know it, would not exist without his efforts. One can actually trace religious freedom, political freedom, free speech, freedom of the conscience, academic study and debate, modern economics, science, economics, medicine, and even good government and the concept of good government, and even the very notion of an individual as a human being, as an individual. We can trace all of that to this monk. But one of his most important contributions was his argument that a universal public education for both boys and girls be provided for by the state. So who is this person? Well, this was a German monk named Martin Luther. But how did this happen? How was Luther responsible for this renaissance of human learning? Well, Martin Luther was an Augustinian friar, but he was not just a friar. He was a professor of New Testament studies at the University of Wittenberg, and he lived in a university town. And so when he posted the famous 95 Theses, these were the 95 propositions to be debated. Now, in the 16th century, these debates were held in Latin among the elites. And in the 16th century, the very idea of a literate labor class reading and interpreting any text was inconceivable. Even the notion that the peasants, but even the middle classes, would be allowed to read the Bible for themselves and make any religious judgments, or frankly, any political judgments, well, that represented a very grave threat to the society. Luther, however, saw matters very differently. At the very heart of his teaching, he urged the returning to the source of the Christian faith, and that is, of course, the Bible. And the faithful could only read, understand, and discuss the Bible if it was available to them in their native tongue. So Luther delivered the first translation of the Bible in the vernacular language of the people of Wittenberg, and that is in German. But a German Bible was of little use to an illiterate population. Therefore, Luther was committed to the idea of universal education. One of his very first acts as a reformer was to recommend monasteries be turned into schools. And he pressed the local rulers to open public schools, and nearly every parish followed suit. But how to fund this? So Luther did what he always did best. He wrote a long letter, titled, "To the councilmen," basically to the politicians of all the cities in Germany, that they establish and maintain Christian schools. Here's an excerpt of that letter. Quote, "It therefore becomes the business of councilmen and magistrates to devote the greatest care and attention to the young. For since the property, honor, and life of the whole city are committed to their faithful keeping, they would fail in their duty to God and to humans if they did not seek its welfare and improvement with all their powers day and night." Now, the welfare of a city consists not alone in gathering great treasures and goods, providing solid walls, beautiful buildings, and a goodly supply of guns and armor. Nay, and how true is this 500 years later? Nay, where these abound and reckless fools get control of them, the city suffers only the greater loss. But a city's best and highest welfare, safety, and security consist in its having many able, learned, wise, honorable, and cultivated citizens. Such people can readily gather treasures and all goods, protect them, and put them to good use, end quote. Now listen to Concordia's mission statement. Concordia University Irvine, a comprehensive Lutheran Christian university guided by Christ's Great Commission, develops wise, honorable, and cultivated citizens to serve the society and the church. Luther's use of the word citizens can serve as a variable for all of the academic disciplines here at Concordia. So wise, honorable, cultivated accountants, wise, honorable, cultivated nurses, scientists, psychologists, kinesiologists, counselors, educators, and of course, wise, honorable, and cultivated political scientists in the room tonight. So Concordia is part of this 500-year legacy of educational excellence. And even in 2023, we at Concordia carry this legacy forward as we serve both society and the church in Orange County and beyond. So I hope that provides a little bit of a brief introduction to Concordia and to our deep roots back to the Reformation and in many ways to the Renaissance itself. And for those of you who know your history, there is so much to say about Luther's indirect influence on characters that we are examining just this week: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, et al. Of course, there's so much more that I could say, but as in most of life, it's better to be somewhat brief, to pause, and to once again welcome you to Concordia. So it's my honor and privilege at this time to call forward retired Commander James Suzuki. Commander Suzuki served in the Navy and completed 3 combat tours to Afghanistan, Syria, and Jordan. Currently, Commander Suzuki is a master's student at Concordia in the MCAA program, the Masters in Coaching and Athletics Administration program. He will come forward in just a moment to offer the invocation, but as he comes forward, please join me in thanking Commander Suzuki for his many sacrifices on behalf of all of us and on behalf of his country, our great country, the United States of America. Commander, thanks.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. So let us pray. Dear Lord, Father in heaven, thank you for this beautiful day and all the blessings and goodness you have provided. Thank you for this gathering and the fellowship of this group and our special guest, Congressman Shimkus. Go Navy, beat Army. We ask that you lift us up with your grace and grant us wisdom and guidance so we can walk with you and serve your will. We ask that you bless this wonderful country we live in. We ask that you grant the United States and its people the wisdom and guidance to be in faith with you and that we can live the values of your kingdom. We ask that you watch over us and we get home safely to our families. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Commander. Our guest tonight is very special. I'm not going to tell you very much about him because most of our conversation will be about him, Congressman John Shimkus. And John, while I'm speaking, if you would come up and take a seat. The very brief bio is that he was a graduate of West Point Military Academy, and following that, he went into the Army and served in active duty for a number of years, remained in the military and the reserves for most of his adult life. Also got his teaching credential right here from Christ College, which is what I learned and made me kind of investigate who this person was. He was a Lutheran high school teacher. Then he got involved in local politics, and like many people in local politics, went on to serve in higher levels of government. He was in Congress for 24 years. And before we start the interview, I'd like you all to know that this is being recorded. So this will end up being on YouTube, probably on several sites. So when you have questions later on, make sure they're good questions. Okay, Congressman, thank you for coming all the way to California and bringing your beautiful wife, Karen. And Karen is a musician. I think you have your master's degree in organ performance, so maybe we should do something a little bit later, but thank you for coming to California. All right, I've got a number of questions. First of all, tonight we're really talking about two things, the Constitution and public service. And you have devoted your entire life to public service. When you joined the military, that's public service. When you got a teaching credential, and I look upon teaching as public service, because one, you'll never get rich, you'll never get famous, but you are doing a public service. And then when you went into politics, local government and then congressional, again, public service. And I should like to say you'll never get rich, but sometimes that's not true. But it shouldn't be that way. So what inspired you at the beginning of your young life to want to go into a full life of public service?
That's a great question. And I think, so I went to a Lutheran grade school from kindergarten till 8th grade. There was no Lutheran high school when I was of high school age. So I think the grade school education, Christian education, was about service to others. In public high school, I got involved in, even in grade school, I was involved in student council. And listen, I like people. I like to get things done. And I think getting involved in student government, I know we have some leaders here, getting around in student government, even in grade school and then in high school, just started that, that little ember of public service.
So it basically came natural. It's just part of your personality.
I think so.
But then what motivated you to apply for West Point? Not everyone gets into West Point. So what motivated you and how were you able to succeed?
Yeah, and I've said this publicly a couple times, so I'm not embarrassed to retell the story. But when I was growing up, the original Star Trek TV show was on. And the Captain James T. Kirk was an Academy grad. And that guy could do everything, right? He could negotiate treaties, he could fight, he could fix electronics. I mean, he could lead, men and women. So that phrase academy stuck in my mind, which then I mentioned to my father, who then when you get to, you have to start making decisions about this. You're like sophomore year in high school. So you're taking the right classes, you start preparing. And he went to the library, brought home a book. Yeah, still have libraries, still had books at those times. And we ended up, it was on all the service academies. And as it was prayed over by the commander, right? I read through the history of the academies. And for me, West Point, which is the Army Military Academy, the original, 1802, it was more leadership focused, it was more personnel focused, it wasn't big ships or fast planes. It just seemed, like if I could get in, that's what I would do. I also applied to the Merchant Marine Academy, which is in Kings Point, New York. My congressman nominated me to West Point. I got in, and then I tried to survive, in which I did.
Now, West Point and all of the academies are very rigorous, very disciplined. What do you take? In fact, we've got some, John Gates is here this evening, who's head of the Orange County Navy League, and Commander Suzuki, and we also have another Army veteran here, Richard Lewis, who is head of our Veterans Resource Center, so they understand the military discipline. But at West Point, it's also a different kind of military discipline. What are the great lessons that you learned that served you through your life after you left West Point?
Well, I mean, our motto is duty, honor, country, selfless service. And regardless of the military branch of service, I think when you enter the military world, you understand that you are entering a group of people who have pledged, like the founding fathers of our country, who in essence pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor in defense of our country. So that then creates a camaraderie of veterans. I think you see veterans kind of will naturally, find each other in events and won't not really swap war stories, but we know that they've answered the call to serve, whether it was in peacetime or in war. And that's when I talk to young men and women who want to go or looking at the academy or OCS, I remind them that, yeah, it's cool to go to academy, but you have to serve, and you got to be prepared to go wherever the country tells you to go to.
Now, as a member of Congress, then you were in a position where you could nominate young men and women to go to the academies.
On average 5. I 5 to 7 a year. It just depends. There's a formula and how many are at each academy and stuff. But yeah, it's a great honor, and even our young men and women who want to go in that direction with their lives, they are just amazing.
Well, and what a tradition you're following. Eisenhower and MacArthur and Patton and so many others. Now, after you completed West Point, then you served in active duty for a number of years and then remained in the reserve and retired as lieutenant colonel. So tell us a little bit about your Army experience, both as an active duty serviceman and then as a reserve officer.
Well, and most of my time was on reserve status. But the first 5 years is kind of just like the formative years of the building blocks, and it bled over to actually things that I still continue to do in public service. So I served there. There was a time in my life when we had 2 Germanys. We had a West Germany and we had East Germany, and there was a border wall. And people who tried to cross from one side to the other, mostly east to the west, would get shot, looking for freedom. And we used to call that Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc. So I served in southern Germany with defensive positions on the Czech border, preparing for a day when a war may occur. And we kind of knew that we were just going to be a speed bump, kind of slow up the first echelon, but that was that period of my life when I knew that I would prepare to give my life for my country. So it was a 3-year tour. It was great. I was a bachelor. I loved Germany. Got to travel because once you're in Europe, getting around Europe, it's not very big. It's tougher to get around the country than it is to get to different countries in Europe. Then I came back to do some additional training. I ended up going, my last full-time station was just north of here, beautiful Monterey, California, with the 7th Infantry Division Light. Then I started thinking about what did I want to do. Did I want to stay or did I want to go into teaching? I had some great teachers that were really influential in my life. And so Christ College, Irvine, accepted me. I resigned, kept my, actually I was a captain. I rolled back my promotion to a first lieutenant to go into the reserves, and then I had a reserve unit up the road from here for about a year. And then I moved back home, got into another reserve unit, and started teaching. And it was great to have that reserve paycheck and the 2 weeks, because I hate to tell some of the young men and women out here, Lutheran teaching is a ministry, which means you're not filling your pockets, right? And so that additional revenue helped me. Karen and I just got married kind of simultaneously, And then I did the reserves quite a bit until I got elected to Congress. And then I still was on reserve status, but not a paid status.
Did you always want to be a teacher? When did that start?
I like people, I like kids, and I think so, yeah.
So as a member of Congress and as a teacher and as a person in the military, you took an oath on a number of occasions. And that oath was not to the president, it wasn't to your constituents, it wasn't to the country, it was the Constitution. What did that mean every time you took that oath?
Well, I think it helped form the basis by which you focus on who you serve, right? I think you identified a few different people who could make people supersede the founding document. But, as we see in our country, as we see around the world, and you hear this in the international space these days, the international world needs a rules-based system, right? You need a system of rules. If you don't have a system of rules, then you have chaos, and we see that right now with the chaos and what's going on in Ukraine right now. But I think the Constitution allowed me to be reminded that our rule-based system of self-governance is in this experiment drafted by our founding fathers, the Constitution.
And they did call it an experiment. They didn't know if it was going to work. Europeans assumed it would not work, and were hoping it wouldn't work. But so far, we've weathered the storm. When you look at teaching, the school here, Concordia, has an excellent school of education. But in our country today, the number of people who can identify the 3 branches of government, or even 3 of the 5 guarantees of the First Amendment, or so many simple facts about our country, they can't do it. We all see it on TV when they send a roving reporter around and they ask questions and the answers are embarrassing. We have a very low level of civic knowledge in this country. What do you think we should do or can do as a country to correct that? They're not teaching it in the schools anymore. They're not teaching it in college. So where do they learn it?
Well, they need to teach it in schools. So it's a failure of our elected leaders. So in Illinois, obviously, the public school system is kind of directed by the curriculum passed down through Springfield, Illinois, which is our state capital. So they then set the parameters of the basic education needed. So in Illinois, you have to pass a Constitution test out of 8th grade. And you have to pass a Constitution test out of a junior in high school, which I think most kids do. The question is, and I know we talked about this before, where is the lifetime learning? Where is the follow-on example? If they're not involved in politics or governments or elections, a lot of people just default and they're not involved politically at all. So if you're not involved politically at all, then the Constitution really means nothing to you. It's interesting. I'm dealing with a very smart, educated individual who's an entrepreneur trying to do this, I think, which will be a very successful project. But he's come to ask me for advice because he has zero. Somehow he missed the education on government. People just think, I'll go to my congressman and he can make it happen. Well, they don't understand that you got to maybe pass a law, right? And then that makes, with a bicameral two-house legislative system, that means 2 chambers have to agree on the same language. And the president has to sign it. Now, do I make this stuff up? No, it's right in the Constitution. That's why it's the fundamental document of how we, sinful human beings, self-govern ourselves. But it's just shocking that here's this guy I have great respect for, and the basic questions that he's asking me about how government operates. And And it shouldn't be that way. I mean, we need our educational our system should be making that high priority. Should be. I was able to teach the last 2 years at our local public university, and I ended up really teaching one class per semester, but it was on national government and politics. And so a big chunk of that was the Constitution, you know, and we'll get through it, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and then bring in people who can talk about that stuff. And I don't know if that university, if that's the only government class that they have 4 years. I just wanted to be involved in education. I wanted to give back. But I do know that when they left my class, they had a better understanding of the Constitution.
Well, I think Professor Brian Santon is in the audience, and he teaches a class here every year on the Constitution. But you know, the Constitution begins with the words, "we the people," and that's us. It's not the founding generation, it's us. And if we don't understand the fundamentals of our system, how can we the people have any real influence? You know, today our public schools are under attack. They were created as public schools because they were common to everyone who was supposed to get basically the same curriculum, you know, reading, science, math, and so on. And part of that was a common knowledge about our government system, federal and state and local government. I've got several textbooks that were written in the 1800s. I've got original editions. I'm very pleased to have those. But they're very different than what students are learning today. They're not learning about the foundation. In public schools, they're coming under attack because the students can't read and write at their grade level. But more than that, the schools are being attacked because they're not notifying parents about young girls getting abortions or transition issues and all of that. Our schools are very divided right now. There is no common way of looking at our schools. What in the world can be done that? And in fact, should that even be a federal issue? It should be a local issue.
Well, I believe in federalism, which is found in the Constitution. So if the folks of California are upset at the California public school system, then the majority of correction needs to be in Sacramento. That's, you elect people. Likewise, in Illinois. Now, it's interesting because when I would be home for my district work periods, I probably was in a school either once or twice every week during the school year, whether it be at a university, college, community college, grade school, or reading to kindergarten kids. That was always a good place to meet with constituents and, you know, kind of give back. And again, the teachers in my part of the state do not ascribe to the edicts that come out of the state capitol. Our state capitol is in the middle of the state, so it's not in the Chicagoland area. But that's where all the votes are, and that's where the more moderate, more liberal of our citizens are. And that directed response, and really, you know, teachers have one or two choices. Public school teachers, they either leave the public school system because they don't want to follow those edicts, or they salute and they do the best job they can under the rules passed by the state legislature.
So the teachers have a choice, but to some degree, so do parents. Parents can remove their kids from public school, put them in private schools, do homeschooling. And of course, a big issue facing the country right now is school choice, where parents would have not only the ability, but some support from the state to put their children in schools that are more likable to particular parents. Let's talk about your term in Congress. You first got elected. The first time you ran, you lost. You lost to Dick Durbin. If those of you who follow C-SPAN or politics, Dick Durbin is the senator from Illinois. So you lost to him. He'd already been in Congress for 10 years, so running against an incumbent's tough. But then 4 years later, he decided to run for the U.S. Senate, leaving his congressional seat open. And you ran, but it was a very crowded Republican primary. What was that experience like?
Well, Politics 101 is if you want to run for Congress, the best time is when there's an open seat, which when Congressman Durbin left to run, or when there's redistricting. 92, when I ran against him, it was a redistricting year. And that helped set the stage for my success. So there's a 5-way primary, but it's in a district that I already had covered, knew a lot of people, didn't know I was going to run 4 years later, but because I didn't know he was leaving. So I think that was really the basis of my success in a primary, because I had run against an incumbent, powerful incumbent, did well for having no money and being new, and then I won the primary, and then a very challenging election, because that was a Democrat seat. And they recruited a strong, in essence, a conservative Democrat, defined by the business community liked him. He's a Second Amendment guy. He's pro-life. There used to be those in the Democratic Party. And I only beat him by 1,200 votes. So it was one of the closest races in the nation, which means that when you get sworn in, and my wife was there, and you open up the paper, where there used to be papers, actually, stuff like this for the kids out there, where you would read the news and paper, and my picture's right in the middle of the middle section of the paper, saying the #1 target in the Midwest, because I had only won by a small percentage of votes. So even before you're even sworn in, you're already on the target list to get defeated in 2 years. Of course, the Constitution says House members run every 2 years, so we knew that, and then we just went to work to do the job. And good government is good campaigning. Good campaigning, it helps you in good government. So they're a symbiotic relationship. People don't understand it unless you've run and you've gone through the trials. But you can't really pull an elected official apart, their politician and public policy person, in one. So then after that re-elect, things got a little bit easier. I did have a tough primary about 14 years later. Even though I'm very conservative, we're in a world now where there's degrees of conservatism. And in some sectors, I wasn't viewed as conservative enough. So I had a tough primary.
Most of the time you were in Congress, your party was in the minority.
I guess if you count the 24 years, but remember I came in with Newt Gingrich, so I came in and got elected in 96. So we had a good chunk of time there, and then we lost, and we had another good chunk of time, and then we lost, and then they came back in after I left. So
What were your greatest frustrations as a member? What was what made it frustrating? We'll get to the good things in just a second, but it's not easy being a member of Congress.
yeah, no, I think you're seeing it now. I mean, if you're watching and you're attentive to the news today, you're seeing where Republicans can't put a bill on the floor because they can't agree. And what usually happens, and I went through this numerous times, and we're in the majority. Again, we got a former state senator here who's, probably was in the minority most of his time. It's a whole different world. But in the majority, you're supposed to govern, and you're supposed to move an agenda. But what happens when you have these fights within your own party is that you eventually lose. You get more by being together than you do by being fractured right now. And every time we got to this point, and I lived through the last government shutdown, and I lived through an almost shutdown 6 years earlier. To open up government, you always ended up giving more back to the liberal causes that you have to go to get votes. So the fact that they can't unite is, and you can see I'm reliving that, and it's just being in those rooms again. when people are, and it's like we're supposed to be a family. There's 90% of everything that people believe in that room, they all believe it. But you're fighting like it's, you're the Hatfields and McCoys. And that makes it
Is some
difficult.
of that driven by ego? Want to make a name for themselves, get the headlines? Is it just plain stubborn philosophy? What drives this disagreement among people who agree almost everything else?
Well, I mentioned this, I say this all the time, and I think there's two things that are collapsing the ability to govern, and that is gerrymandering, which are politicians drawing lines and trying to incentivize a number of their party. And what that does is shove all conservatives in the district or all liberals in the district. So you lose that center. So when I was able to get elected in Dick Durbin's old district, he was a Democrat. I had to be respectful and I had to listen to the Democrats I was still their representative. Even though I was a Republican, I'm still the representatives. But when you push voters into these districts that map-wise, that doesn't make sense, right? And the only reason why it doesn't make sense is because you're trying to get all the partisans in one district. And then I also think social media is just destroying the middle. And people now can have a national following, even though they're only one of 435. The only following I cared about when I was in office was either the 20th District of Illinois or the 19th District of Illinois or the 15th District of Illinois. Those are my three different districts. I didn't really worry about, Republicans in Colorado or Florida. I just worried about getting to know my constituents. But now I think you could be, a progressive leftist socialist in state A and get funding and support and encouragement from state Z and flip the coin. Same thing with a conservative or a far right elected member. They may be, they could be in Florida and be getting support and encouragement from Arizona. And I think that's a change in dynamic that is not healthy.
I think that brings up several questions. One has to do with campaign finance, because it used to be people would support their local candidates for government. And now we have super PACs, we have millions of dollars that flow from entities who really don't even know the candidates in many cases. I've kind of had this theory, it may not be constitutional, but it seems to me that you should not be allowed to contribute to a candidate if you're not eligible to vote for them. But campaign finance seems to be a real problem with politics today.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our campaign laws that we are under now occurred because we passed campaign finance reform, which I voted against that bill. But it was an attempt to get big money out of the political parties. And what it did was, money's going to find its way. The Supreme Court, another big part of this debate on the Constitution, has ruled that money equals speech. So that legislatively you can't deprive people using money. And the other issue is a uber wealthy individual. Now, I'm in Southern California, so I don't even know what that is by definition. But nothing would prohibit the person from spending their entire family fortune to get elected.
And some do.
But you know what? Most of those folks lose, believe it or not. When you look at the wealthy people who get involved and try to pour all their money in, the vast majority are not successful, which I think is a tribute to our system, because they're not really buying it. But there are some. I mean, so how does a middle class, or my wife would say lower middle class kid from Southern Illinois, one of 7 kids, and dad's a telephone lineman, and mom's stay at home, how does a person like that compete against someone with wealth? So you have to allow them the ability to raise money.
Another issue I think is really important is specifically a constitutional issue. The founders created 3 co-equal branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. They're supposed to be co-equal, but it seems like over time that balance has shifted. I mean, today Congress passes about 150 laws a year, but executive regulatory agencies put out about 3,500 regulations a year. The Congress has basically given the power to the president to go into war when the Constitution clearly says that Congress shall declare war. We haven't done it since World War II. We have presidents of both parties who, with a stroke of a pen, and they've actually said that, I may not be able to do this, but I've got the power of the pen, can literally spend billions of dollars from the taxpayers without going through Congress. It seems like, one, has Congress abdicated its power to the executive too much? And then too often do we hear members of Congress or other people who are involved politically say, well, whether or not it's constitutional, we'll let the courts decide. That's not totally their role either. So it seems to me we have checks and balances that are unbalanced, and our separation of powers is less separated than what the founders put forth. So
I think you've asked me that 6 different ways, so I'm going to try. I'm trying to figure out how to respond. So what helped me getting a handle on this was teaching, going back to school and teaching. The nation has grown exponentially. What do we have? 330 million people in this country now. What is California? Almost 30 million people in California. 40 million, 39, yeah. So 40 million people. You need roads, bridges. We provide health care. So that's one reason why government has grown. So has the executive branch grown more powerful than the executive branch based upon the growth of the country, and that he is the chief executive officer by definition? And what is a chief executive officer? Well, we have the president here, right, of the university. He's responsible for everything this university does or fails to do. It's pretty simple. If the mics go off, he might get blamed, but really it's the president's, it's his game, right? So running this big national government, and that's where then how does the president do that? He does it through his agencies, through his secretaries and the like. Now, do we have the power of the purse? Yeah. Go back to what I just talked about a couple minutes ago. What is the fight going on in Washington right now? It's spending. And these conservatives want to say, so when I got elected, our national debt was $4 trillion. I was aghast. I left 24 years later, and the national debt was $30 trillion. On my watch. Guilty as charged. How does that happen? Well, I think it's easy to give people things, and it's hard to take things away. And the other thing that, as far as our fiscal house, is that mandatory spending, which we call the entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, are really not any part of our budget fight. But they are a big part of our debt. It's like your pension benefits, your health care benefits of any organization. These are promises to pay that you've already given. So that's the challenge we have. It's also very curious. I kind of knew checks and balances was that's like intro to National Government 101, right? This is just stuff you got to cover. So look at this fight that's going on right now between the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a co-equal branch of government. You know, the senators can huff and puff all they want about forcing the Supreme Court to do A, B, or C. Check the Constitution. Do they have any power or control? The only thing they have, well, they can affect their salaries. They could expand the court. That's within the Constitution. But can they force regulatory compliance on the Supreme Court? Nope. Can't do it. I mean, that's where, you know, in any debate on the Constitution, you're going to talk about how you view it, this document. Is it aspirational? Is it something you kind of, well, we'll figure it out as we go? Or is it fundamental and its black and white language is to be trusted and valued? We call those either originalist, take the original language, the written language, and that's how you will make determinations on what the government, or textualist, what does it actually say? Be a textualist. That's where I lean in that camp. And why? Because, you know, if you don't like the Constitution, you can change it. It's a living document. Just add an amendment. Oh, that'll never happen. Well, it has, numerous times. So that's why I get tired of people fighting. The Second Amendment, David, is a great argument, because if the people don't want to allow our citizens the Second Amendment right enshrined in the Bill of Rights, then let's have the fight where it should be, which is an amendment to the Constitution. Any language of law, if you are a textualist or an originalist, should fail before the Supreme Court, if our Supreme Court justices are of that mindset. That's why the executive branch races are so important. Because right now, the way the parties are, as you know, you from the Democrat Party, you'll get a activist judge. And from the Republican conservative side, you'll get a originalist or a textualist. And that's where I want to be.
Well, in defending the Constitution, as you just said, it all is from your point of view, because people read it. It's almost like reading scripture. You know, different people from different denominations may interpret things differently, and yet there's the fundamental text that should be the ultimate guide, then overlaying that with interpretation. You mentioned the power of the purse. There's a bill in Congress, which probably won't get too far, called the REINS Act. And looking at all of the regulations that are promulgated by executive agencies, which are under the executive branch, and impose billions of dollars on our everyday behavior in business and everything else, the REINS Act would say that if an administrative agency would promulgate a new rule which would have the ultimate implications of over $100 million, which sounds a lot, but under the federal budget it's not that much, that regulation would then have to be approved by Congress. What do you think of that kind of proposal?
Well, not only have I probably co-sponsored that legislation numerous times and voted for it numerous times. So it's one that's been around, but again, it's an example of how hard it is to pass a bill. I mean, the House of Representatives can pass a bill when that, obviously a spending bill is not difficult, but it's a simple majority. But the way the rules are set up by the Senate, you need to filibuster. So to answer your question, I support it, and I voted for it.
It seems to make a lot of sense to me. One way of bringing government under control. You were on the, I think it was the Energy and Commerce Committee for a number of years, and at one point you were ranking member. And if those of you don't know what a ranking member is, you're the individual in the minority party who's the highest ranking on that committee. And if you were in the majority, then you would become the chairman. What were your major accomplishments, and what was your role like on that committee? It covered some pretty important issues.
Yeah, I was with a friend of mine and another friend. Actually, So Mike Boss is a congressman who lives south of me, and Kevin McCarthy was in to do an event. So we're talking before the event, and obviously Speaker McCarthy says, "What is it you miss about Congress?" And I said, I miss, obviously my friends, that's an easy default, and both sides. I said, but I miss crafting the deal, getting legislation across the finish line, not only across the vote on the House floor, but getting it through the Senate and getting it to the president's desk. It's very challenging, especially if it's a tough bill. I mean, you can name a post office, right? That's not very, which we do all the time. But those are the easy things to do. So when you get elected to Congress, sometimes people want to go into the committees where they have experience. Like some people would have expected me to be on the Armed Services Committee, or maybe in the Education and Workforce Committee. I was directed to try to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is a big committee. Very powerful. I'm glad I got help. You just can't do this stuff alone. But so then you get on subcommittees, and that's where you learn the deal. I mean, what do I know about nuclear power, right? I was an infantry guy. I was a high school teacher. But I was on the committee that dealt with nuclear power. I was on the committee that dealt with telecommunications. I was on a committee that dealt with healthcare. So I was on a committee that did environment. We called it environment and the economy. So when the parties changed, they kind of changed the name of the committees. So we did it environment and economy because we wanted to balance saving the environment but keeping the economy strong. So there was a bill passed in 1976 that happened to be, I had an afro and bell bottoms and platform shoes. It was an ugly sight. That was the year I graduated from high school. And it was the toxic chemical bill. It was a bill passed, federal law, how you identify toxic substances and make sure that if you're using them, they're protected or you don't use them, period. Well, it hadn't been reformed since 1976. So we went to work to rewrite that bill using current science, all the different stakeholders from the Humane Society to the chemical producers to the chemical transporters to, it took 5.5 years, which means 3 Congresses. So you went through a couple elections, passed in the House, Republican controlled, passed in the Senate, I think Democrat controlled, and signed by President Obama. Pretty big deal, and something I'm glad I was able to get across, and I think it was helpful. Now get it to the regulatory agencies. The other great story about this is, then we were, I think both sides were waiting to say, okay, I hope our guy wins the president because then he will do no more harm. And the Democrats, who were my friends, were hoping, okay, I hope Hillary wins because then she'll use the regulatory agency to steer it further away because we thought we gave up too much. And that's where the agencies get involved in the language, and that's where litigation and lawyers, because really they need to go back to what's the language of the law. But the other problem with that is to get bills passed in a compromised manner, sometimes there's an intentional vagueness in the law. Because one side wants to read it this way, the other side wants to read it this way, so they find a word that's, you don't know what it, it's vague, but that's how you get the bill passed.
So sometimes it comes down to shifting the blame a little bit. We'll handle this and let other people work out the problems. And you just hope those other people are your guys and not their people.
Right.
A number of years ago, you did an interview in which you answered a question about how divided the Congress was. And your answer was, well, we're divided, but we compromised and got some major bills through, such as the highway extension and the Veterans Administration bill. So you said the division is there, but sometimes it's exaggerated. Going back to that interview probably 8 or 9 years ago, would you say that Congress is more or less divided today?
Again, I think what's separate now is that, well, yeah, Congress is more divided because the parties are more divided. You, you can't, if you can't get your team to agree on a play, then you can be assured that the defense will blow up the play, right? Mm-hmm. So again, it goes back to this gerrymandering. This goes back to social media. It goes back to, I'm in California, everybody expects me to say this, I'm a big Ronald Reagan fan. I give him a lot of credit for the reason why I look to the Republican Party. You know, and I hope not liberally quoting him, and he would say, give me 80% of the deal and then I'll go back and try to get the 20 later. We don't have people like that anymore. They want all or nothing. It's all 100%. Or, I mean, even in our own party, right? I got friends who are saying, no, I don't want this 80% deal. Now's the time. But then you go back to the $30 trillion national debt and you can say, where was I? You know? So gosh, you all should be politicians. It's so great. You know, it's great.
How many of you have heard of the country of Lithuania? This is very good because if you would give a geography test to most Americans, they would say, Lithu what? Well, you were also a member of the Baltic caucus in the Congress because your grandfather was a Lithuanian immigrant. So what do conferences or caucuses in the House do that have a narrow focus such as the Baltic?
Yeah, and he was my great-grandfather, Casper, came over in 1896. And then he brought, we think, a mail-order bride from his home congregation. Those Lithuania is 93% Catholic, 3% Lutheran, and 3% others. I mean, so it's mostly a Catholic nation. I mean, I'm right here in Orange County, and she's not here because she's back in Lithuania. Angela Nelsis and Ron, they are Orange County diehard Republican Lithuanian activist. And so what happens in Washington is people assume you're an expert on an area of the world based upon the ethnicity of your last name. And there's a lot of people come from all over the country and all over the world to talk to politicians and senators. And of course, they could easily look down. Shimkus, that's Lithuanian. I'm going to go talk to him about Lithuania. So, long story short, it was, I think, 1998 NATO expansion. A couple countries got in. The Baltics didn't get in. There was a signing of the Baltic Charter, which was an attempt by the United States to say, we love you, Balts. You're not ready. We want to create a better, stronger relationship. Being Lithuanian American, I got invited. And guess who I get sit right next to? Angela Nelsis from Orange County, who then for 2 straight years harassed me to establish the Baltic Caucus, which I did, along with a guy, you may have heard his name, Dennis Kucinich, the child mayor of Cleveland. Dennis, there's a lot of Lithuanian Americans in there, and we had a great, here's an example of people who are totally opposite but could work together for what we felt was a great cause, was encouraging Eastern European countries. This goes back to my serving in West Germany, helping Eastern European countries who wanted to look west, which is freedom, democracy, rule of law, and to get invited into NATO. And by golly, they got in. And now you see what's going on in Ukraine. You can see how now they're thanking God and NATO for allowing them access. So it's been a great, you look at a career, you just, that's one of the things you can go to bed, sleep well at night. Well, no one's sleeping well in Eastern Europe right now, but we did a good thing.
Well, I understand President Biden was recently in Lithuania and met with the president there. You recently, I understand, joined a lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., and when in an interview, You said something that has really come out tonight in this interview. You said, shaping public policy is my passion. Looking forward to helping our clients understand and navigate the process in our nation's capital. I think that's something that a good public servant would do. I have two questions, and we're going to open up to the audience here. Lobbying is often given a bad name. When you think of lobbyists, you think of guys coming in with money sticking out of their pockets and say, I need you to vote this way. And but lobbying, it's really an honorable and very important profession. Would you talk a little bit about what lobbyists do? Because I believe in them, unless they're doing something illegal, but that's true with any profession.
Yeah, that's a great story. So, as a member of Congress, you get a chance to see stuff, archival stuff, and during different events. And I remember we were doing something at the archives, and they had a big stack of old paperwork with a big red ribbon typed around it. And they said, and this is long ago, right? Government document. So they would hire individuals to help go through the paperwork, to cut through the red tape, to see what was in the document. So that's where that whole red tape comes from the archives of history. So I'd get this asked as a member of Congress all the time, and I'd love it, a group of people. And they would say, tell me about those evil special interest lobbyists. And I said, okay. I said, how many of you are members of the Farm Bureau? Raise your hand. And I'd go, what about the American Legion? Any folks out there members of a union? I'd go through about 4 or 5, and by the time I was done, like 95% of all the hands were in the air. Because I have teachers there. And I said, how dare you all be involved in evil special interest groups? And they're looking around, well, not me, but because they're involved. So we're talking about the Constitution, right? So the Constitution specifically provides protection and encouragement for people to collectively organize to air their grievances. So that's what associations do. And what associations do, they hire people to try to get the inside information when their interests might be harmed. Now, I don't do much lobbying. I mean, I don't go to D.C. I've only been to D.C. maybe once this year, maybe twice. And one was just for a party. I mean, I wasn't. I mostly do business development, which is connecting, especially, the firm is KBS. It's renamed. Was formerly Kit Bond Strategies. Kit Bond was a former governor of Missouri for many, many years, and he was a U.S. senator. So when I retired, they said, you want to do stuff every now and then. And I said, sure, but not too much. So they'll have someone interested who may have a corporate headquarters in Missouri, and they want to expand over in Illinois, but they don't know anybody. So then they say, hey, can you introduce us to people down in Marion, Illinois? We helped a company down there. Now we think, there's north of Madison County, we have another company that's looking at a couple locations in rural Illinois to maybe do some manufacturing. So that's what I like more than anything, because it's very helpful to my people, my locals, and so I can stay active.
Well, I've always felt lobbying is really important because as a member of Congress, and even as a member of a city council, you have to know so much about so many things, and you can't. It's impossible. And so you rely on people with expertise, with more knowledge about a subject to advise you, to give you information, or to introduce you to people. So lobbying is really very important. It's only bad when somebody comes and says, well, here, you'll do it for this money.
Well, and that's illegal too. I mean, there are
Exactly.
laws, and those who have done that have gone to jail. So, but the other aspect about it is a good lobbyist, and I've thrown 2 out, never to come back in my office, but over 24 years. So that's really, that percentage is very low. A good lobbyist will say, here's who I represent. This is their interest. This is why we think it's harmful. And then sometimes I'll ask, well, what do your opponents say? And they'll know the other side. They're going to come in, they're going to say this. So then the other people come in, right? Because what they want to do is they want to get their information in front of the policymakers when we have to make a vote that we fully understand where they think they're going to be harmed or benefited.
And it's a very important part of the legislative process. I spoke to a DAR group a week ago, and they wanted a presentation on the amendment of the Constitution that gave women the right to vote. So you're thinking of Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton and all of the sit-ins and the demonstrations and the hunger strikes. That's all the sexy stuff that got the media. Even then they had the media. It was called newspapers and a little bit radio. But what really got that amendment through was the same thing that gets through legislation, is the hard work of counting your votes, knowing who's on your side, who's not on your side, how you can persuade them. I used to call them saints, sinners, and savables. The saints are the people that are on our side. Don't bother them too much because they're already there. Don't waste their time, but keep in touch. Then there's the sinners. They're totally on the other side. You're never going to win them. So don't bother them. Don't rile them up. Just leave them alone. But then there's those in the middle, the savables. And what is it about your issue that can affect them? And so what I did with this group, I presented the legislative strategy, the hard work that the women lobbyists did. And it wasn't all the stuff in the streets that made the difference. That was important, but it's not made the difference. Okay, my last question is this, and then Richard, if you'll get ready with your microphone to see if we have some questions. Faith is obviously a very important part of your life. And I was going to ask you what important role does faith play, but it's not faith, it's what you have faith in. I mean, we had faith that these chairs wouldn't fall down when he sat on them. So you're a man of faith, but your faith is placed really where?
Well, I looked at your verse for this year, right? Abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. You have a fruitful life when you abide in me and I in you. So, and I think our pastor just preached on this verse a couple weeks ago too. And I think the interesting thing is we got future pastors and teachers and church workers, but that doesn't say that there, does it? And part to the president's mission statement, right? We're called to be to minister to the people around us in whatever chosen profession we end up in. If you're going to be a hospital administrator, I met one. That's what he wants to do. So that's our mission field. And so when I was in the Army, my mission field was my friends and my soldiers in my unit. And I didn't heat them over the Bible, but they sure knew that I went to chapel, and they knew that I did devotion, and they knew that I didn't go carousing most of the time, right? Maybe once or twice, but not every weekend. I wasn't out there. So, and likewise, as a county treasurer, it's leading by example. So, my close friends in Washington, members of Congress, and there are people of all different faiths, and some are strongly involved. There's a lot of Bible studies on Capitol Hill. People don't know about that. Plus, it's not a good news story, right? No, the news media doesn't want to report on actual members of Congress praying together, right? That would be crazy talk. That's our mission field, and again, fortunately, I had my wife, who's we're equally yoked. I think that's important. I was fortunate to obviously marry a Christian who's of the same faith and can raise her kids, and it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So it's worked out.
That's wonderful. Are there any questions? Richard's back there with the microphone.
Okay, I'm gonna stand. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that, and it's really cool to get to hear from someone who's been involved in this way. You said earlier, you were like, I wish all of you guys were in politics, and my first reaction, it's not a Star Trek quote, but it's from Star Wars. Obi-Wan Kenobi's like, I'm not brave enough for politics. I don't know if anyone else feels like that in this room, but for me, like politics almost feels like this super fast moving freeway that it's impossible to merge into. And I'm wondering what encouragement you may have, what tips, or not even tips, but like insight you have on entering the political game, as it were.
Well, I would make sure I talk to the guy in front of you who has had some experience locally with that. The world in politics has changed quite a bit. But listen, I'm not understating from whence I come, right? I'm one of 7 from a father who is a AT&T lineman, stay-at-home mom, and I served in Congress. The Constitution's great. You don't even have to be from this country. You can come, move here, then become a naturalized citizen and get elected to Congress. I knew quite a few of them. So if they can merge into this lane, you surely can, right? What we eventually, and I didn't take this normal path. I mean, I'm abnormal. But most people I know who are involved in politics today get involved in campaigns at a young age. They get to know people in the political party. They see people's work ethic, and they encourage them based upon how they see them interact to do more. Parties are designed to help elect like-minded individuals. That's why you have a party. We've, not because the Constitution said it, we've just evolved to be a two-party system. So you got to pick a team. And I usually say that. Now, I'm a conservative Republican. I think everybody should be a Republican, but I know they're not. I don't discourage a liberal from picking their team, right? But then they have to get involved and got to get engaged. And that's how I think you enter today. I was a fluke because I moved back home after a career in the military to teach high school. And I was in a county that was fully controlled by the other party. So no one cared if I ran, right? I could win anyway. But I won a few races, and then people thought, well, maybe this guy can win. But we can talk later, too, and I can exchange emails, but it's just, you just got to connect up with the political parties, and if it's a good political party, they want to encourage young folks like you to be involved, and they're always looking for volunteers, always. And that's the best way to start, is to volunteer. I just did a literature drop for the first time in 4 years. It was for our 175th history walk, and I dropped literature around the church community, which I've wanted to do for years, and I finally did it. And that's really a good exercise, because you really get to know the people of the community, whether you talk to them or not. So anyway, I volunteer and get involved. And you're going to see, again, the leadership story is that when you're involved in organizations, you look at the leaders who are running them, and then you pick the qualities and traits that you think work and are good, and you disregard those that you think are bad and not healthy, right? Because leadership is really, the definition of West Point is the ability to get people to do what you want them to do, not because you force them to do it, but you inspire and you encourage them to do it. So find those type of people who are involved in the political team you want to join and learn from them.
There were some other questions.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. We really appreciate it as a university. My question concerns your original concern, I think both of you shared, about the lack of basic knowledge of the Constitution and government in general by a lot of average Americans. And you spoke to this particularly connected with not understanding the three branches, how they work, Constitution in general. And I'm out of high school now for only like 3 years. I have a pretty current understanding of, having that education and having government within our high school system. So I come from a rural region of Pennsylvania, not necessarily known for the best high school education, but it was mandated that I take government. And so I don't think that's the real issue of people not having this basic understanding of government. It's not because it's not within the education. The real problem from my perspective was government was offered senior year of high school. Some of my friends didn't make it to senior year of high school. There are problems with their family that they had to drop out and take care of them. There are drug issues. There are reasons that people don't get to that level of education and consequently don't have an understanding of the Constitution. But creating social programs, I think, that would address some of those concerns and enable more people to stay in high school goes in direct contention with the issue of the national debt and that raising debt because implementing those social programs costs a lot of money. We're at $30 trillion. So I'm just concerned and curious in how you reconcile those and are social programs a viable way to solve this issue? And yeah, how do we reconcile that with national debt? Is it a ranking of which is more important? And what do you say to that?
So I think you've got, obviously, I think two questions. One's on the debt, and then one is how do you continue to incentivize people to really know and believe and trust in the Constitution. And I think it was premised by, I'm saying this way so I make sure I've gotten in the right, that we need to make sure we have social programs that help educate people when they fall through the cracks. Right. So I'm a big believer in federalism, which means public education is primarily directed by the states. And so state programs to help do those things is not, I always would tell people, show me in the Constitution where there is a responsibility for the federal government to be involved in public education. This is a discussion on the Constitution. Guess what? It's not there. It's not the Founding Fathers' intention. Was it a nice thing for the national government to do and say, we ought to be helpful? That's where our emotions get involved and override what the founders' intent was. And I think the vast majority of Americans said, yeah, the federal government should be helpful. And then the question is, when the federal government gets involved, are they helpful? That's great, because that's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah? Well, remember that you can always add and subtract to the Constitution by an amendment. That's why it's a living document. Well, I think now, because, we had the debate on the growth of government. We already have a federal Department of Education. It's not going anywhere. So how do you make it efficient to address these concerns without it being burdensome to the state public education system? So we have Title I programs, which is food and nutrition. It's very helpful to make sure our kids have some sustenance when they come to public schools and now get breakfast and lunch, right? So that's a good program. Now the question is the other things. If maybe the mandates on some state programs that may be cultural challenging and costly, right? So those get fought in the state. And the other one was just on the debt again. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think the national government, the new chairman of the budget committee is a guy named Jody Arrington from Texas, a friend of mine. And when he was what happens when you get the chairmanship, they compete. So there's a couple people who apply to be the chairman, at least in the Republican conference. And then there's a small committee that votes on who they think, and then they take those names to the full, we call it a conference, some people call it a caucus, the full conference, and the full conference has to agree on who's the budget chairman is. So it's not like Kevin McCarthy didn't say, okay, Jody, you're going to be budget chair. You're going to have these people. So why do I talk about Jody Arrington? Because when Jody got it, I said, congratulations, let's rewrite the budget law. The budget law of today was written in 1974. When the legislative body passes the budget, does that mean anything? The answer is no. You would think, it's not a law. It's just a budget resolution. It's aspirational. So it's not like you pass a budget and the president signs in a law and those are the numbers. Our numbers come through what we call the Appropriations Committee. And that's these fights we're seeing right now. So I would rewrite the budget law and have the fight, right? Again, you got the president. You got to know the numbers. How much are we going to get in? How much are we going to spend? Well, we're all messed up in Washington, and hence $30 trillion in national debt.
One last question.
I don't use microphones often. I was hoping you could explain a little bit in your experience how the 10th Amendment works, given all the powers the federal government undertakes that the Constitution does not enumerate for it.
Well, the 10th Amendment just says if it's not written here, it's the responsibility of the states. That's the education question. It's not written here, it's the responsibility of the states.
I understand what the 10th Amendment means. I was just wondering your experience about how the federal government does follow.
Well, I mean, it's great. I think of some examples. Again, remember when you get elected as a representative of a group of people, I got asked this before this event tonight. Most people are running for office to do good, regardless of their ideology. You don't run for office to be a jerk, to destroy the lives of the people you represent. You don't do that. Now, you may have a different values of how best to help them. Like some people think we need bigger government to help people. They're Democrats, they're liberal Democrats. You might have people like me who believe, no, smaller government's better for my people to do, for the people I represent to succeed. That's the difference between the two parties. But it's easy, I mean, again, education's a perfect example. It's not listed in the Constitution. Do you want to go and say, no, I don't think education's important? If something comes to the forefront? That's the challenge. And guess, when you make that decision and you cast your vote, guess who's the final arbiter? Your voters, right? They're gonna decide whether the choice and the vote that you made was good or bad. They're gonna let you know. And probably next time, if it was bad enough. Here's a great example. The financial bailout of 2008. Tough times. My party's in control. I can't remember the Secretary of Treasury. President Bush, I love President Bush, was lobbying us to vote yes on the financial bailout. I voted no. Why? Well, two things. I believe in risk and reward. I think if you want people who raise capital, assume risk, get a reward, a lot of people who do this in the real world, they lose money, right? They fail. Abraham Lincoln failed, 5 times? Went bankrupt? So then, right after that vote, I had to go to a parade. I remember it like it was yesterday, Salem, Illinois. And I didn't know how the voters, I was expecting them to run me out of town. But you know what? they were applauding me. Now, my leadership probably wasn't happy. George W. Bush wasn't happy. The Secretary-Treasurer wasn't happy. You know, especially when the Secretary-Treasurer comes in and says, you're going to be responsible for the next Great Depression if you vote against this. But I was shocked that I was received that well from the voters in the parade line. Now, I know you're limited time, but there was an older guy in the middle that wanted one. There was a young lady struggling with the Constitution over there, wanted to ask something. You want? Yeah, go ahead. Go. Ten. What? Yeah. No, I'm just like, that's what the founding fathers, you can read it. Right, delegated, right. Right. Well, and that's the separation between originalists or textualists and people who think we should be a little more open. I mean, that's really the whole debate on the Constitution. And that's fine, and that's great. Let me talk about commerce. The Interstate Commerce Clause is one of the bedrocks, and it's based upon states taxing other states. It's very simple. So then the question is, what is interstate commerce? And it just grows into actually, California is really an interesting example. Because California, you know, under the Clean Air Act of 1992, Southern California was given the ability to determine their own air regulation standards in Southern California because of the terrible pollution that was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So they have been given more ability to regulate versus any other state. And now since they have so much market power, the question is, de facto, are they creating national standards by their ability to control local emissions? So it's an interstate commerce debate. There was another great Supreme Court case on hog confinement, which I think most constitutional scholars thought would go the way of the hog confiners. I don't know if that's a proper word. But it ended up, the state of California won that case, that they could limit the imports of certain pork based upon how they were handled. That's the great thing about our Constitution, right? Why do you have courts? This is what I tell my students all the time. Why do you have courts? Anyone know why you have courts?
To avoid violence when you have disagreement.
To resolve disputes. You have courts to resolve. So we can write laws. There can be regulatory regimes in place. There always are going to be fights. They're going to take them to the federal courts. Eventually, that has to get adjudicated. Someone has to make the final call. And in a constitutional debate, it's usually the appellate court or the Supreme Court per the Constitution. If you don't like it, what do? Change the Constitution, amend the Constitution, or pack the courts, which you could do. But I would advise against that.
Well, all I can say is it made me feel so good to see someone hold up the Constitution in their hands and ask a question. Congressman, we thank you so much for visiting us. This has just been great, and we'll applaud in just a second, but I do have a couple of gifts for you. One is this. This is kind of a commemorative of the Constitution, a lot of our founding documents. I know you've read them all, but maybe never with gold leaf on the side of the book. And then We also have the symbol of the United States is the eagle, and it's also the symbol or the mascot of Concordia University. So here is a lovely crystal eagle for your desk. And then finally, I have to give
This
you
is
this.
the president's expensive book?
Pardon me?
This is the president's expensive, no, it's not? Wow.
No, this is not President Thomas's expensive book we were talking about earlier. One of my favorite people in history was William Pitt. There were actually two William Pitts. There was William Pitt the Younger, who became Prime Minister of England about 3 months after we signed the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. He was 24 years old, and his name was William Pitt, but his father had been Prime Minister of England during the 7 Years' War, and we were English then, and his father, the great commoner, who was one of the greatest Prime Ministers of England, was the Earl of Chatham. Now that rings kind of a bell with me, but they were both on our side during the Revolutionary War and the period before that, when the British imposed the Stamp Act on us in 1765, which is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and we got really upset. Well, by then, Lord Chatham, isn't that a wonderful name? He was still in Parliament, and he took our side. He told Parliament, he said, don't do this. This is a bad move on Parliament's part. This is not good to do this, Americans. And he gave one of the best lines, I think, of all world history when he said in front of Parliament, he said, remember, the Americans are the children, not the bastards of England. And so this is the biography of his son, William Pitt II, who became also Prime Minister. And then, Karen, we have a little gift for you. This is a replica of the 1887 White House cookbook, but the modern version is bipartisan. It has recipes from Hillary Clinton as well as Barbara Bush. So everyone, join me in thanking him for a great discussion and for coming to California to see us.
Thank you.